Hi, my name is Sarah Whaling, and I'm a life and relationship coach certified in integrated attachment theory and specializing in reprogramming attachment styles, healing from narcissistic relationships, and healing the subconscious mind, which is the step past awareness in the healing process when lasting change is created for the life that we want. Starting off with the basics, what exactly is an attachment style? An attachment style is something that every person has, and you can think of it as whatever that person's subconscious set of rules for relating to others is. It is basically what is normal to you in regards to behavior in relationships and coping strategies in relationships and life. For instance, a fearful avoidance coping mechanisms for conflict are different than a dismissive avoidance. Our attachment style is originally formed between the age of 6 months and 2 years, and it is based upon the relationship we have to our caregivers. We are also heavily programmed throughout childhood, especially up until the age of 8, because our brain waves are highly suggestible up until this age, almost like a sponge absorbing what is around us. So there are four attachment styles: fearful avoidant, also sometimes called anxious avoidant or disorganized, dismissive avoidant, anxious preoccupied, and securely attached. Now, when we are talking about the three insecurely attached styles, the way that they are formed goes back to what happens when a core wound is formed. When the mind cannot make sense of what is going on in a traumatic situation, it gives it meaning. I have come to see in a lot of cases that a lot of this meaning that is assigned is often based on how something makes someone feel. Attachment styles are programmed into the subconscious mind the way that our beliefs are, because it is basically a set of beliefs. Whether that ends up being good, i.e., securely attached with good enough parenting, or insecurely attached with the type being based upon the wounds and trauma from the type of parenting they received. The set of beliefs of our attachment style is reality as we know it in regards to relationships. Now, obviously, at 6 months to 2 years of age and in childhood, the brain does not have the capacity to understand, for instance, that they have a neglectful parent. Instead, the brain makes it mean something about them. Children are egocentric. They cannot understand that the world does not revolve around them because they do not have that capacity. This is survival related. This is the natural perspective to get their survival needs met by their primary caregivers. Children must believe they have capable caregivers because their survival hinges on it. For all of these reasons, if their needs are not met, they make it mean something about them. We can see this, for example, in the dismissive avoidant attachment style, which is the attachment style formed mostly from neglect. If a child is not getting their emotional needs met, they can form a shame wound and come away with the belief, i.e., core wound, of something is wrong with me, which is one of the biggest core wounds of the dismissive avoidant. They form this wound because the mind makes sense of the situation by concluding that if they have emotional needs that constantly get neglected by caregivers, there must be something wrong with them for having these needs, and it forms the shame wound. So, what is your attachment style? Here are 5 common characteristics of each attachment style. Attachment style number 1, the fearful avoidant. Characteristic number 1 for fearful avoidance. This is the attachment style associated with the largest amount of trauma. Now, examples of this can include growing up with emotional and physical abuse, growing up with a caregiver or someone very close to you with a personality disorder, such as BPD or NPD, experiencing sexual abuse, having a caregiver or someone very close in childhood with substance abuse issues, coming from a home environment where there was a lot of fighting and chaos, seeing a parent cheat, having a caregiver who was unpredictable or had a lot of emotional highs and lows, being parentified and having to shoulder too much responsibility, or being made to feel guilty with an emotionally struggling parent. It can also include what could be considered smaller, repetitive traumas on a very regular basis, such as consistent boundary issues with a parent. These are just some examples, but this is going to be the attachment style that is most common if an individual has experienced higher levels of or more trauma. Characteristic number 2 for fearful avoidance. It is very common for this attachment style to have the I cannot trust or I will be betrayed core wound. Now, why is this? Usually, because of the way that a fearful avoidant has grown up, there was some form of betrayal in childhood, whether it be mistreatment or something that was witnessed, and then it makes sense, right? Because it stands to reason if I cannot trust my caregivers, how can I trust anyone? Characteristic number 3 for fearful avoidance. They often have the most core wounds. Because of the larger amount of trauma associated with this attachment style, they most commonly have the most core wounds out of the attachment styles. Another reason for this is because fearful avoidants share some of the wounds and coping mechanisms of both the anxious preoccupied and the dismissive avoidant, which brings me to the next characteristic. Characteristic number 4 for fearful avoidance. They quite often swing from anxious to dismissive and dismissive to anxious and have both sides, making them share some wounds and coping mechanisms with anxious preoccupieds and dismissive avoidance. That is why they are sometimes referred to as anxious avoidant attachments and disorganized attachments. That is what is seen often, and you can sometimes see a fearful avoidant right in the middle of the spectrum on that with equal dismissive and anxious qualities. But another thing can happen, and that brings me to characteristic number 5 for fearful avoidance. Fearful avoidance can lean either dismissive or anxious. For instance, a fearful avoidant who leans dismissive will be predominantly fearful avoidant and share a lot of characteristics with a dismissive avoidant. There will be some differences that still show they are fearful avoidant. For example, you generally will not see a dismissive avoidant display a lot of volatility. So in a fearful avoidant, you could see that plus, as an example, maybe a deep fear of vulnerability, which is also something that is shared with the dismissive avoidant. So you would see that they are fearful avoidant leaning dismissive. Sometimes, when a fearful avoidant leans anxious, in the beginning of their healing journey, when they're first learning about everything, they mistakenly think that they are anxious preoccupied. And it's only later that they find out, after learning more, that they are actually fearful avoidant. But a fearful avoidant leaning anxious can have such a strong anxious side that it can feel like they are anxious preoccupied. Attachment style number 2, the dismissive avoidant. Characteristic number 1 for the dismissive avoidant. This is the attachment style that most often comes from neglect. Now, this is a factor of dismissive avoidance childhood that can actually be hard to spot for some dismissive avoidants, because many dismissive avoidants would not recognize their childhood as neglectful. Many times, they may even describe it as ideal. Especially if there was not outright chaos and physical needs were met, emotional neglect can kind of fly under the radar sometimes. Characteristic number 2 for the dismissive avoidant, slow to warm up. They can come off as cold upon first meeting someone, and they are very slow to be vulnerable in relationships. Why is this? This is because the dismissive avoidant learned early on that vulnerability hurts, so as an adult, they avoid it. Characteristic number 3 of the dismissive avoidant, the shame wound. One of the dismissive avoidant's biggest core wounds is I am defective or there is something wrong with me. Shame makes us want to hide. This is the reason behind many of the dismissive avoidance actions, such as avoiding vulnerability, not having someone over to their home, often needing time alone, though that is not the only reason, being slow to warm up, etc. Characteristic number 4 for the dismissive avoidant, slow to or hesitant to commit. This is the attachment style that is generally more comfortable moving slowest in relationships. For instance, an anxious preoccupied could be ready to commit to someone in a few weeks, whereas a dismissive avoidant might be more comfortable with 6 months to really take the time to get to know someone and see if that person is a good fit for them. Characteristic number 5 for the dismissive avoidant: conflict avoidant. Some of the dismissive avoidant's greatest needs in a romantic relationship include harmony, lightheartedness, peace, etc. They generally were not shown a roadmap for conflict in childhood, and their coping mechanisms for conflict can include stonewalling, shutting down, avoiding, and fleeing, the flight trauma response. Attachment style number 3, the anxious preoccupied. Characteristic number 1 for the anxious preoccupied: one of their biggest core wounds is the abandonment wound, or the I will be abandoned slash I will be alone core wound. Now, this is something very much shared for many unhealed fearful avoidants, and this is one of the biggest reasons that some fearful avoidants mistaken themselves for anxious preoccupied upon first learning about attachment styles, because this wound can be so strong and so painful. The anxious preoccupied's I will be abandoned core wound comes from either inconsistency, i.e., one parent was a good parent, but maybe they worked a lot and they were there and they were attentive when they were there, and then they were absent, so it was inconsistent attentiveness, or it comes from real or perceived abandonment. Characteristic number 2 for the anxious preoccupied: they are often very warm, likable, and friendly people upon first meeting them. Generally, in their relationships and social interactions, anxious preoccupieds are preoccupied with how they are received, if people like them, how their interactions go, and they are the attachment style that likes proximity to their partner. So even if this attachment style is triggered, they all overall are most likely to conduct themselves in a way that aims to maintain this proximity. Characteristic number 3 for the anxious preoccupied: they commonly have the trauma response of fawning. Now, we talked about how the dismissive avoidant often avoids conflict by fleeing. The trauma responses include fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, and this last one is what you often see in anxious preoccupieds. Why is this? An AP often wants to address conflict, but they will walk on eggshells in order to avoid abandonment. This is also a way of noting a difference between an anxious preoccupied and a fearful avoidant, because while they both can share a strong abandonment wound, a fearful avoidant is generally not afraid of conflict. And it is common for the fearful avoidant to have some volatility that you will not see in an anxious preoccupied. Characteristic number 4 for the anxious preoccupied: they often have the relationship expectation of, my partner should soothe my emotions. An anxious preoccupied is not programmed to self soothe. In childhood, they had a caregiver that would soothe their emotions inconsistently. They came to rely on that soothing and then felt abandoned when that caregiver would leave or was inconsistent for periods of time. So we can see how this reliance and then fear of abandonment is literally a deeply wired part of the anxious preoccupied's subconscious comfort zone and program that kind of plays on repeat. Characteristic number 5 for the anxious preoccupied: they can have attention or approval seeking behaviors and sometimes clinginess as behavioral coping mechanisms when triggered in their relationships. An example of this could be if they cannot get a hold of their partner, they call that partner multiple times compulsively, even knowing that this could be against their better judgment. Now, if you are an AP and this is you, recognize that this behavior is not your fault. It is a trauma response, and all of this can be healed. Attachment style number 4: the securely attached. Characteristic number 1 for the securely attached. This is the attachment style that grew up in a household where there was enough consistency, presence, love, and safety. Nothing is perfect, but there was enough of this stability and meeting of these important needs to create a stable, secure attachment to the primary caregivers. Characteristic number 2 for the securely attached. Securely attached individuals can still have core wounds, but they will have much less and they will be less frequent and less intense. It is common for the securely attached core wounds to be more situational in nature and limited to more specific experiences and not showing up as in as many facets of their lives as the other attachment styles. Characteristic number 3 for the securely attached. They have a healthy relationship to their boundaries. A securely attached individual usually grows up in a household where boundaries were taught to be a good thing. How does this happen? Boundaries usually got their needs met, and there wasn't punishment or dismissal. There was healthy room for them and respect, and because of the lack of negative backlash and the good outcome, they have hardwired beliefs about boundaries that allow them to easily set them. Boundaries were a normal part of life in their household. Characteristic number 4 for the securely attached. The relationship need for resolution of problems with healthy solutions. Securely attached individuals have learned healthy conflict skills growing up, and their coping mechanisms during conflict generally include communication and identifying and actioning their needs. Characteristic number 5 of the securely attached. They are generally stable and emotionally balanced. This attachment style feels negative emotions less frequently as a byproduct of less core wounds and painful thought patterns. Well, I want to thank you for tuning in today, and if this video was helpful, I encourage you to give it a like and subscribe to join me for more weekly content.